Okay, guys, so the past 2 days we've been talking about the experience of people migrating to the United States. We've talked about the native experience before the arrival of Europeans. Yesterday we talked about the arrival of Europeans and the arrival of black African slaves from Africa. Today we're going to focus on colonial America and what life was actually like here. So the first thing you did today was you took your geography quiz. If you haven't taken your geography quiz yet, go ahead and stop the video and you can use this map to take the quiz. So when we talk about colonial America, remember that the British were not the only people that colonized here. And actually, if you look at this map, you'll see that the continental United States was actually mostly colonized by the French and the Spanish. But what's important is the British colonies, because those are the colonies that stuck, and those colonies would eventually expand to include all of the present day United States. But pay special attention to Florida, just to the south of us. Florida actually originated as a Spanish colony and was not part of the original 13 colonies. We would get that back, though. Now, when we talk about the American colonies, we usually split them up based on their geographic location. So let's go ahead and look at this map. Now, we'll separate them into three separate areas. We call this most northern point New England. This includes modern day states like New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Then, just a bit south of there, we have what we call the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then we have your southern colonies. That's your Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And all of these colonies varied based on their economies, based on their culture, the types of people that settled there, and they started developing very differently. It's important to note that at this point in time, nobody really saw themselves as Americans. They saw themselves as British, and they saw themselves as people from their colony. So a Georgian was very much a Georgian, and a Pennsylvanian was very much a Pennsylvanian. There was no sense yet of an American. There was no American identity at this point in time. Now let's start with New England. Now, New England was populated with small towns and lots of sustenance farming. Those are smaller farms started by families to help feed themselves. So they're not necessarily these huge plantations like we see in the South. Now, they had lots of small businesses. They would make cloth. They had blacksmiths that would make metal tools. They had a very diverse economy. Their two biggest economic sectors were shipbuilding and fishing. I mean, if you look back at the map, you can see that New England is very close to the Atlantic Ocean, so they have lots of access to fish. And also, it was very wooded, so they had lots of trees, and they used these trees to make ships. Now, don't forget that the most characteristic group of people that settled in New England were the Puritans. These are the people who left England to escape religious persecution, but not because they were Christians, because remember, Europe at this time was predominantly Christian. It's because they were religious extremists. These Puritans, they rejected anything that would be a distraction from their devotion to Christ. So I want you guys to go ahead and stop the video, and I want you to read the reading about a city upon a hill. Now, the middle colonies, this differed because they had larger farms. They grew things like wheat, and they had large port cities. When you think of New York and Philadelphia, these are large cities, and they use these to trade. So there's lots of trade going on. They also had more industries like sawmills that would make lumber. They had mines and ironworks so they could build metals. This is really where most of the immigrants came. Puritans dominated the settlement of Massachusetts and New England, but lots of immigrants came through and settled in the middle colonies in Philadelphia and New York. A lot of English and a lot of Germans, too, actually came to these areas. So if you go to Philadelphia today, if you go to Pennsylvania, there's lots of German influence because of this heavy migration. Now, there was another religious group that settled in the middle colonies. We call these people the Quakers. Now, the most identifiable thing that the Quakers have is their oatmeal, and that's what the name comes from, is the religious group. The Quakers are very interesting. They were pacifist, which means that they rejected violence for any reason. So they were completely 100% peaceful. They also were the first group in the Americas to speak out against slavery. So it only took us a little while to catch on to what they were saying, but the Quakers had some pretty good ideas. So here's just an image of what a middle colony town might have looked like. You can see that it's one, more settled, it was more heavily populated than New England, and two, it was more industrious. They had more industries, they had larger cities. Now let's go to the southern colonies. Now, we know this because we live in a former southern colony. We have large scale agriculture, things called plantations, these gigantic farms where people grew cash crops. And they were reliant on this African slave labor. They grew things like tobacco and cotton and indigo and rice. And this stuff was really, really, really hard to farm. And so that's why they used the Africans as slave labor. By far, the most profitable thing the South had was tobacco. Like I said yesterday, the Europeans couldn't get enough of this stuff, and this really, really enriched colonies like South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. Now, North Carolina didn't receive a lot of the benefits of a plantation economy because we didn't have as many plantations. North Carolina was less populated than South Carolina or Virginia. They had less slave labor. Our economy was just set up to be small sustenance farming. So when we think about the southern colonies, usually South Carolina and Virginia are the two that people think of. Now, the southern colonies traded this tobacco. They traded these cash crops to get the other things that they needed. Now, by and large, the most important thing from the southern colony was slavery. Slavery would be an issue that would go on to dominate the United States politics all the way from colonization up through the Civil War, which finally had to settle the issue of slavery. Now, the colonies, we were British territory. We were under British control. But each colony did have a certain amount of self-government. And there are a couple of reasons for this. We were able to govern ourselves. One of the reasons was just logistics. I mean, the colonies were really far away from Britain. So it's not really like the British could give us direct responses and direct directions right away and we could respond to them. It usually took about 3 weeks at the quickest to get across the Atlantic Ocean. So direct rule was pretty much logistically out of the question. But this ability to self-govern ourselves, Virginia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, we could set up our own governments, and this helped establish a pattern of American autonomy. Autonomy means you can take care of yourself. You don't need anybody else. And we became used to this, and we began to expect this. And this is going to impact our history, especially our colonial history, all the way up until Revolution. Now, over time, the colonists noticed that they did not have all of the same rights as English citizens. And so that kind of rubbed us the wrong way. Because remember, guys, at this point, we are British citizens. So we were frustrated that we weren't getting all of the benefits like freedom or a guarantee of right to a free trial, freedom from unlawful search and seizures that people were getting in England. We just weren't getting the exact same treatment. So we were a little salty about that. Now, the first really signature American moment was the Great Awakening. Now, this happened in the 1730s, and it was a religious revival. And these fiery preachers, they questioned the authority of established religions and established Christian churches. And they gave these fiery sermons. I actually want you guys, before we talk about this, to stop the video, and I want you to listen to the speech of, it's called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. So I want you to listen to this and then discuss with the sub what things you notice about this speech. So go ahead and stop the video and listen to the speech now. So in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, I want to point out a couple things that I'm sure you noticed. One is the imagery. The imagery was meant to strike fear into people. We had these preachers that would give these fiery sermons, and the people really, really bought into it. Okay, it really led to a religious revival in the United States. But notice, one thing you might not have noticed is that there's no mention really of priests or bishops or the establishment. The Great Awakening focused on an intensely personal relationship between the individual and God themselves. Now, try and connect this to the American identity, but we were kind of shirking tradition. We were shirking authority and focusing on an individualistic relationship between God and ourselves. And that's really going to apply to politics when we start thinking about our separation from the Europeans and from the British and really making finding our own way. So, sinners in the hands of an angry God. These preachers would travel all over the place and they would draw these huge crowds. Now, this is also important because this is really one of the first truly American experiences that we all have together. And it kind of brings us together a little bit. Another thing that brings us together is the 7 Years' War. Now, this was fought between England and France. Now, you might also hear this called the French and Indian War, and that's because the British fought against the French and their native allies. Now, we fought on the side of the British because remember, at this point in history, we are British. And really, the fight was over land. Okay, the French and the English, our territories in the Americas, were brushing up against each other. And so eventually we went to war. Now, like I said, the colonists and the English, they fought side by side. And what they noticed was that the colonists had a lot more in common with each other than they did with the British. Someone from Virginia and Philadelphia and North Carolina were a lot more similar than the troops that had came straight from England. And actually, the English troops treated the colonial troops as second class. And so they kind of bullied us around a little bit. That brought those troops together and kind of added on to that development of an American identity. So it developed that bond. Now, here's the map. Now, the British and the colonists, they did win the 7 Years' War. And so this pretty much eliminated all of the French. Look at the red territories here. Those are the territories that the British had before the war. Now look at the pink territories. Those are the territories that the British gained from the war. They gained lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of land. Awesome land that the colonists wanted to settle, especially in the Ohio River Valley up here. This land was great, and the colonists couldn't wait to settle it. I mean, they had fought in this war. They wanted to reap the benefits. Well, the British had acquired lots of territory, but the king decided that the colonists would not be allowed to cross the Appalachian Mountains. One of the reasons for this was the British wanted to maintain kind of good relations with their natives that were neighboring them. Honestly, not a bad idea, but the American colonists at the time didn't think it was so great because they wanted to move into this fertile soil that they thought that they had conquered, that they thought that they had earned during the French and Indian War. So another issue that happens with the 7 Years' War is it's expensive, and the British went into massive debt fighting the war. In order to make up this money that the British lost, they decided to raise taxes on the colonists because, well, the colonists were the primary beneficiaries of this war, so the British thought that they should have to pay for it. Not a totally unreasonable measure. The colonists, though, do you think they were super stoked about having to pay more taxes? No. Fun fact, at this point in history, the Americans were still paying less taxes, lower taxes than their counterparts were in England. But that really wasn't the point. The point was the colonists felt as if they were being taken advantage of. I mean, they were left alone to their own devices to self-govern themselves for a while. Now, all of a sudden, the British are getting more involved in government by telling them they can't cross the Appalachian Mountains, and the British are levying these taxes on them. So I want you to watch this video, 7 Years' War Crash Course, and really get some more information about the 7 Years' War. So go ahead, stop the video now and play this video. So now that you guys have learned about the 7 Years' War, I want you guys to take the graphic organizer and produce original visuals that represent the important ideas we talked about. So I want you to create visuals for the 3 separate colonies, and I want you to create visuals for the Great Awakening, the 7 Years' War, and the Proclamation Line. Now remember, your images should highlight what was important about the specific subject. not necessarily just a picture. So you can see here in New England, I drew something for the Puritans, and the South something for tobacco, and the 7 Years' War is something to talk about bondage. Now, you are going to turn this in on Monday. Have a good day, guys.